Okay, let's get started. So it's 11 o'clock. Thank you everybody for joining us. My name is James Hunt, and I am one of the co-founders at Binc, and I'm excited to welcome all of you to today's webinar on how to map a talent market by Boris Epstein, my fellow founder here at Binc. We are very excited to deliver today's topic or webinar on today's topic of how to map a talent market. Generally speaking, we've been doing these webinars now for the last several months and really enjoy the opportunity to share and give back to the community what we've learned over the years through the variety of recruiting engagements and projects and efforts that we've been a part of. And so excited for today's topic, which Boris will be covering shortly. The topic, how to map a talent market, is one of many things that we've grown to really kind of see as a good systematic way to think about and approach recruiting and the strategy around sourcing and figuring out who to target as your target talent. And so excited to share that with everyone today. And Boris is a long time recruiting veteran, has been recruiting for almost 20 years in the realm of technology and beyond. And Boris co-founded Binc actually in 2002, and has grown Binc to the company it is today, which has worked in all parts and pockets of the recruiting industry, and everything from early stage, seed stage startups, all the way through your Series A through Series E and pre-IPO and publicly traded companies, and has worked on any number, you name it, any number of searches within the technology field, and taken that really developed this systematic approach that he's going to be walking us through today in terms of mapping a market. So without further ado, I'll introduce and hand it off to Boris to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, James. Appreciate the intro, and appreciate everyone joining us today during what I'm sure is a busy Tuesday and January. So I'm personally very excited and passionate about the opportunity to talk today about the concept of how to map a talent market. Something that's been near and dear to my heart from the very early days of my career in recruiting. My entry into the field of recruiting was from the agency side, and I associate or I observed the world of recruiting, including a lot of what can be described as job fillers, get a job, fill a job, get a job, fill a job, and I didn't observe a lot of strategic approach to the work that was being done. And so from very early on, I was able to associate the concept of mapping a market or understanding all the target companies in a certain demographic or all the different players in a certain demographic with recruiting success, or at least recruiting differentiation. And it's been that home base and foundation that I developed in those years that was able to carry on to some of the foundation that we've developed and continue to promote here at Binc to help our embedded recruiting team achieve their respective success across their diversity of clients that they serve. So from a purpose perspective, if there's anything that you get out of today, it's my hope that you leave here with just a little bit more excitement for the concept of market mapping and the value that it could bring to your world in recruiting or as a hiring leader, that you identify market mapping, whether you choose to use it or not, that you at least identify and respect it as a foundational nature of the search process, and that it empowers you in whatever role you may find yourself in, whether recruiter partnering with a hiring manager or hiring manager looking to more effectively leverage your recruiting team. And then finally, the applicability, recognizing that the market map in and of itself is nothing more than a tool, but its applicability is where the power of market mapping can come into play. And so through this webinar, the way we decided to set this up, because there's so many ways we could have skinned this, we decided to start with some purpose, which we just went through, and then what we're going to do is we're going to jump right into a simulated search kickoff meeting or an intake meeting where a recruiter and a hiring manager get together and incept a search. From the inception of a search, we're going to talk a little bit about map theory. So what is a map? What are some common types of maps? What do maps look like? Then we're going to go into the process of actually building some of these maps for the search that we incepted. And then after we build our map, then we're going to pop back into that collaboration with our hiring manager to walk through what a standard calibration session could look like. So you'll see an application of that market map that we work so hard to build. And then we'll close it with a couple of takeaways. And so from a timing perspective, I expect the content of the webinar to run for about 30 minutes or so. While we're running through this webinar, which will have a fair amount of content breadth and depth to it, you may find yourself having questions, or it may prompt discussion ideas. Our vision and idea here is, while I'm going through this webinar, for the chat bar to be as active as you make it. And so if you do find yourself having questions or ideas or feedback you'd like to throw out there, feel free to stay active with that in the chat. We have our leadership recruiter, Will White, here on the webinar with us, who will be actively engaging in the chat. And so for people that have questions, Will be there to engage that. And then any questions that are valuable for us to be covering at the end, we'll have a question section there where we could open that up for wider discussion. So with that, let's jump right into the search kickoff meeting with our hiring manager. So in the search kickoff meeting, for any recruiter who's worked through one of these, we know that there are three main goals in that meeting. Neither of them are more important than any of the others. It's obviously important to cover the value proposition, to understand, why is it that a candidate would be excited to consider and ultimately join for this opportunity? What is the process, the interview steps, the compensation, immigration factors, cultural attributes, etc. Obviously important, no less important than what we will be discussing today. But for today, we're going to focus our energies in on that target candidate. Who is it that the hiring leader is actually looking for to join their team? And so for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to make up a search. We're going to pick one of the millions that we could have chosen. And for this webinar, we're going to go with a standard Bay Area mobile engineer search. And the reason we picked this one is because we thought it would be applicable enough to our to the people in this webinar, as well as, if it's not applicable, then at least relevant enough from a vernacular perspective that everyone will be able to follow along. And so in this case, through the intake or kickoff meeting with our hiring manager, we learned that they're looking to hire mobile engineers. They're looking to hire individual contributors, anyone from junior all the way up to principal level. There's no preference on school. They do prefer that the person have a CS degree. They'd like to see the person join from a mass consumer company. They'd like the person obviously to be skilled in the mobile realm of skills, from mobile, Android, iOS, etc. Communities, in this case, there's no preference, but what we like to define as a community is any place where a target demographic of people may find themselves congregating. So as it relates to the world of recruiting, it's possible that there's a community that makes up a LinkedIn group, or it's possible that there's a Slack community that all has some attribute in common. Popular community that could be targeted could be an open source community that's all gathering to build some piece of technology, and that may be a target or part of a search criteria. And so in this case, again, no preference on community, and then the location. The goal is to find someone who is currently in the Bay Area. So let's jump then immediately to our first poll question, which Kirsten here will kick off. And the question is, upon completing the intake meeting, the recruiter should immediately begin what? Okay, looks like answers are coming in, and by majority vote and the right answer, it is building a market map. And of course, I'll use this opportunity here to recognize that for as many different types of recruiters that exist. There are as many different types of first steps and approaches to the recruiting process. And so perfectly fine to do any of the other steps as a first step in the process. But for the purpose of this webinar and for the purpose of recruiting fundamentals, we are recommending that building a market map be the first step post an intake meeting. Okay, so let's jump into a little bit of theory. What is a market map? And if I ask that question of 10 recruiters will probably be able to conjure up an association with what's being referred to. But if you ask them to repeat that back, they might describe it in a handful of different ways. And so for the purpose of this webinar, a market map is the analysis of a defined segment of the talent market. So defined segment is a valuable attribute of a talent market, and it being able to be analyzed is a secondary attribute of a market map. A market map can vary in size and shape, and that's probably why if you ask 10 different recruiters, they'll probably describe a handful of different sizes and shapes of what their market map might look like. And it can come in the form of a list, a spreadsheet, a database, or a presentation. And again, depending on its purpose and depending on who it's being presented to, that will influence and inform the size, the shape, and the form that it comes in. And so let's take a look at what some of the common map types are. So you could associate your own frame of reference with a market map with what we're going to be covering here. The first type of market map that we find commonly used is what we'll refer to as a company's map. A company's map is basically a list of companies that has a likelihood of employing whatever talent it is that you're looking for. So in our case, if we were given the request to recruit mobile engineers, then our company's map may include the total list of companies that employ these mobile engineers. And so the company's map view will include the list as well as a handful of attributes about each of those respective companies so that that map could be sorted and filtered for the purpose of prioritization, planning, strategizing, et cetera. Second type of map that's common is a candidate map. And a candidate map is essentially a list of candidates with a variety of attributes identified about each of those respective candidates. Now, that candidate map could take a lot of different shapes and forms. It could be a candidate map of a single company. If your goal was to map all of the candidates or map all the talent that works for a single company, that could be the focus of the map. Or if you wanted to create a candidate map of the talent in the total set of companies that you've identified, that could take a second shape of that candidate map. A third type of map is what we refer to as the overview. And so for every map that you create, there's the actual particulars of that map, there's the list, and then there's the overview, which is the summary of the findings there. And so what's common in the overview is to note the size of the map, how many companies are in this company's map, or how many candidates are in this candidate's map. What are some of the insights or demographics about this map? And what's anything that may fall into the camp of summary for what this map includes? And then finally, because you can get as creative as really your imagination as far as the types of maps that you create, some additional options could be a community map. Again, if we define community as an open source community as an example, then we could create a map of all committers or contributors to a certain open source project as an example. If we wanted to build a university map, if, for example, we were targeting the graduates of a certain degree because the expertise in that someone earned from that degree is applicable to a certain job type, then mapping the graduates over a certain set of years might be a valuable exercise. Or an event map. It's fairly common in our industry for people with common skill sets to congregate in events. And so mapping events or sets of events might be a value that a map can take. And so let's take a look at a couple visual examples of these. So again, you could associate what's written here in words with what they physically look like. So this is a sample company's map. And so as to not give away anything proprietary, we whited out the name of the company and the quality rating here. But this company map includes what was described previously in the form of the names of the companies and then a handful of attributes about them. And in this case, the attributes that were valuable for us included the technologies that made up the tech stack of the company, where the company was located, some info about the stage and the funding so that it's really easy for us to filter and sort based on whatever that our client's preference may be. And then a little bit about the engineering demographic. And in this case, the two columns for engineers show the total number of engineers, and then the engineers with a particular skill set that happen to be valuable as part of that search criteria. So again, this could take a handful of shapes and forms and directions depending on whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish with your map. And so hopefully this gives you some sense of what one can look like. Let's take a look at a sample candidate map here. And again, this again takes the same shape and form of there being a candidate list. In this case, part of our strategy included some connectedness on Twitter. And so we whited that out just for confidentiality's sake. And then from there, you see some common attribute types about a person's background, which could include their title, where within an organization they may exist, a little bit about their educational background, location, and then link to the LinkedIn profile so we could engage upon them from there. We'll later talk about the calibration session, but one thing we like to include in our sample candidate maps is you could almost imagine extended fields here to the right that allow for collaboration between the recruiter and the hiring leader. And so in this case, there might be a column here for whatever the recruiter might think the likelihood of fit is or applicability of fit might be. And then there might be a column right next to it for comments. And then even further over to the right, there might be a column for the hiring manager to share their same feedback. And so through this exercise across a cross-segment of candidates, you can do some really nice aligning between recruiter and a hiring leader using the again, applicability of this market map. Okay, let's jump to our second poll question. What are the benefits of a market map? Amazing. Unanimously agree that the benefits of a market map includes 1, it guides recruiting activity, 2, builds credibility with a hiring manager, and 3, informs business decision, thereby the right answer being all of the above. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about kicking off our search. We talked a little bit about the theory and the concepts behind what a market map is. Now let's get into some more practice. Let's actually build our market map for the mobile search that we've been engaged to fill. We'll bring back the attributes that we learned through the search intake or search kickoff meeting. And again, just to recap, we're looking for a mobile engineer, open in terms of seniority, no preference on school. We'd like them to have a CS degree, work for a mobile consumer company, skills iOS, Android, and mobile, and then we'd like them to be based in the Bay. So let's start building some maps. The first type of map that we like to build, and we didn't talk about this as an example, but this could be an adaptation of what we refer to as a candidate map. And what we'd like to do is map the team or the company that's doing the hiring. So in this case, we had a hiring leader and they're looking to hire mobile engineers. And so the step 1 in the mapping process is to map that hiring manager's team. Now, they didn't ask us to do this, and we likely in the kickoff meeting volunteered that we would do this. They probably shrugged it off. But the purpose of doing this is for us to get a really great sense of what the current team looks like and what the destination for any hired talent will look like as well. So let's take a look at what a sample map looks like for the company that the hiring leader works for. And in this case, we have the same format that we saw from the standard candidate map. It includes the name of the person and some attributes about the person. And what we were able to learn here just from creating this map is that the level of person that the engineers, the team employs right now, currently hovers in the mid to senior range between 7 and 12. That's good for us to know, because one, that matches the direction of the search that we were given. 2, we were able to learn that at least the people that we mapped so far graduated from schools that were we recognize as being good enough schools to consider schools to be an interesting factor to look at here, because the direction that we were given was that school isn't a preference. And now while it might not, and while it might be totally coincidental that the manager is open to hiring people from any school, in this case, it just so happens that they employ people from this target of a demographic. The degree seems to match if we associate math with being close enough in proximity to CS, although that is something we would bring up in a calibration meeting just to double confirm whether the direction should be CS specific or if they're open to expanding that pool to include degrees like math and other technical degrees that may be associated in nature. And then from a past company, a practice that we like to employ when building maps is looking at not only the attributes of the candidates that we're looking at, but also where they came from. And that's a great technique to use to help expand what we'll later look at as being our company's map. And so as far as tools to use for this exercise, this is a very elementary exercise. There's really very little skill level it takes to build a map like this. If you know how to use a spreadsheet and the internet, you could build this map. And so LinkedIn is a great tool to build this map. If you're working on the in-house side and you have good partnership with your HR team and they're open to it, then you could use what already exists in an HRIS system to map this. And then a spreadsheet is a fine enough tool to use to create the visualization for this output. So now that we've mapped our company, let's take a look at mapping the companies. And so when mapping the companies, it's common, if you've been around in a market for long enough, you have some instinctual sense of what companies to target. This may be the third, fourth search that you've worked on of the same, or it may be one that you're just familiar with based on your expertise in the market. And so coming up with an initial set of companies tends not to be the most challenging thing in the world, but it does tend to be a challenge. What we found with in our recruiting experience, it is a challenge to expand that map once you've hit an initial wall, once you've run out of that initial set of companies to identify as potential home bases for that talent. How do you expand it? How do you double that? Where do you go when you need to expand that map? And so what I decided to do just for the purpose of this is pull a visual market map from a quick 3-second Google search, just so that the audience here can see what exists out there with just a little bit of research. And again, just a little bit of research, literally less than 10 seconds of research, I was able to find a mobile market map that included a set of companies that maybe in total fit your demographic. Maybe you'll need to do a little bit of tightening up here, but this includes quite a comprehensive set of companies that can or may or may not be valuable to be included in your company's list. And there are maps like this. I'll give credit to the company here, Trinity, that put this together. There are maps like this that exist for all sorts of different cuts and segments of the market. So I'll venture to say that regardless of the search that you're building, there's probably a similar looking map that could be a great head start or piggybacking to get started on your company's list. And so in this case, here's what the start of our company's map looks like. And again, we're targeting mobile engineers here in the Bay Area. And in this case, based on some mapping work that we did here, we identified a handful of recognizable companies and then some attributes about them that we found valuable. And so we see the location, we see the total number of engineers that the companies employ, which is an interesting data point in and of itself. And then from there, we see much more specifically what the target demographic looks like for the Android population and for the iOS population for those respective companies. And then as far as the tools to use in building this, obviously the industry map that we just showed is a great tool. We like to use Crunchbase, which is a great sortable tool for creating filtered lists of companies. LinkedIn is a great tool to use. I'll include the note about using past maps here because reusing a past map or building a map for the purpose of reusability is a great technique for a recruiter or a talent team to employ to build up their quote unquote asset base leverageable tools and assets that they could use to get a head start or move through a search faster than they might if they had to start from the beginning. So applying it to this case, if I knew that I worked for a company that had a heavy need for mobile hiring in the Bay Area, and I knew that that's something that either myself or my team was going to be focused on for the greater part of a year or for the greater part of the foreseeable future of my employment with this company, then investing in a mobile talent map for the Bay Area would be a great use of time because we know that of how much value that would add to myself and my team through our efforts there. So now we've mapped our company. Then we've created a map of all the companies that the talent could potentially work in. And now we want to build our candidate map. So for the purpose of the candidate map, we'll follow the same format that we've followed. In this case, we'll specifically use the technique of building the map up to a size of 20, an initial size of 20. And the main goal in building this up to an initial size of 20 is that we want to use that 20 for our following calibration meeting to confirm and validate that the direction we've taken is the actual direction we should be taking. While it's alluring to build the complete list or a 100-person list or a 500-person list to really get that head start, doing so does run the risk of overbuilding and then only to learn that you may have been a little bit misaligned on direction. So we do like to curb that candidate map at the 20 size for that purpose. And in this case, in building the initial candidate map, interesting findings here include the companies that the people work for, if you'll remember, resemble the companies that the people came from in joining the team that we're going to be recruiting for. So that's a plus that we're going to use to get validation from our hiring leader. We see the years of experience here has some, at least resembling to the current team and makeup. We see that the schools in this case, we decided to include a little bit of breadth on the school. So we included 2 people with educational backgrounds that seem to match the existing team and one that doesn't. And so we're going to want to use that breadth of talent profile to either get confirmation from our hiring leader that we are on the right track in not looking at school as a identifiable attribute, or if we do find that the hiring leader really does have a preference there, then we're going to want to acknowledge that so we could tighten up our search particulars. And so again, some of the same tools that we've used for building our past maps are the same tools we'll want to use here. Okay, so now we've mapped our company, we've mapped the total companies that the talent may exist in. We've done an initial mapping of the candidate market, and now we're going to take a look at the overview. So this is really where some nice insights are going to be surfaced. So the first map that we're going to take a look at here is the national overview of the mobile talent market. And now, in this case, while we were given the direction to specifically look for talent in the Bay Area, we thought it would be valuable to map not only the Bay, but to map the remainder of the major markets in the country so that when we come back to the connection with our hiring leader, we're prepared to not only talk about the size of the Bay Area market, which could then lead us to understand how long it will take us to engage that market, how long before we expect us to feel saturated or ready to move on to a different market. And then from there, a sense of what other adjacent markets or secondary markets may be valuable for us to either include in the search from the beginning or set the expectation that we might need to include at some later point in the future. And through this process, we're also able to identify some interesting tidbits of information or insights that may or may not have been obvious, but for this mapping exercise. So, but for this exercise, I may or may not, for example, have included that or known that Toronto was a number 4 mobile market. I may or may not have noticed that, some of the companies that are the major employers of talent in Toronto, if I'm recruiting for a company that I associate as being a more desirable place of employment than some of those companies, then there may be a strategic benefit in identifying a market like Toronto as being a more immediate destination or immediate a place to either recruit from or potentially even build a secondary office if that were part of the company's vision or strategy. And then also on the note of schools, while some of these schools here may fall into the common vernacular of what is commonly associated with top schools, there are some that surface up here that I may not have associated with that top school focus if that were a criteria, but that are clearly graduates of top mobile engineering talent in the market. And so I'll want to keep that on my radar to use to either validate efforts or to educate hiring leaders or to expand search criteria on an as-needed basis. So now that we've taken a look at the map overview of the country, now let's localize our efforts here to look at the map overview of the Bay. And in this case, the top line number here, 8,837 mobile developers in the Bay, which came from our national map, can then be looked at in a little bit more of a scrutinized fashion around understanding where and at what demographic these individuals may exist across the Bay Area. And so we see, some of the numbers of employment at some of the major companies. And also interesting finding is around the number of people that fall into this segment at various levels of experience. And so if, in this case, we're given the breadth of target candidates all the way from junior to principal. But if, for example, we were asked to target junior level mobile engineers for some strategic reason, we would note that the market for this segment is on the fairly small side, and so that would influence how we engage our hiring leader on either time to engage or motivation to expand the breadth of that search criteria. And so using a map like this not only helps us to better partner and better support our hiring leaders, but it also, from a recruiting perspective, helps us prioritize, right? Obviously, in a market segment of 8,000 target candidates, we're not going to go after all 8,000 at the same time. We may not even be able to get to all 8,000. And so where do you start? Where do you go first, second, and third, and why? And why is that plan and path a valuable and optimal plan and path to take? And then how long is each respective direction going to take us, and how might that influence what the hiring manager expects to see, and in what order? And so now that this is the last slide here for the building a map section, and so now with what we've built here, we have a mapping of the company that we're recruiting for. We have a mapping of all the companies that fall into that demographic. We have a mapping of the candidates that fit within that demographic, and we have an overview. And so before we jump into the calibration session with our hiring leader, a quick pulse check poll on to what degree what we've been sharing here has contributed to any level of enthusiasm or plan to use this market map tool in your recruiting when you go back to your desk. Okay, and the options here being more or less are the same, and it looks like at least the large majority are either excited to use market mapping more in their recruiting, and a handful about the same. And so that's great to see. So now we've kicked off our search. We've talked a little bit about map theory. We've built our actual maps, and now we're going to jump into the follow-up calibration meeting with our hiring leader. And so to set the stage for this meeting, it was likely scheduled a week ago. And so it's possible the hiring manager is really looking forward to this. And it's also possible the hiring manager completely forgot about this. It's possible that you have 30 minutes scheduled, or it's possible you have an hour scheduled. It's possible the hiring leader will be on time and waiting with bated breath, or it's possible they'll show up late and not even know what this is meant to cover. And so being able to capture their attention, engagement, and also cover everything that's valuable for you is really the goal of this session. And so in this calibration meeting, which we like to schedule about a week into the search, we like to start it off with the MAPS overview. And because the MAPS overview is usually insights that will directly feed the hiring managers or hiring leaders motivation of empowerment in terms of understanding what the total market demographics may look like. They with that information, they'll know what they're working with, and they'll then know that you as the recruiter know what you're working with as well. Then from there, we like to jump right into the showing them of what their team looks like, so they could really quickly either nod their head in affirmation that they are looking for more of those attributes or an extension of those attributes, or if for a strategic reason they're looking to specifically exclude certain attributes that may exist on their team, then that would be a common output of that section. Showing them the company's map is a great confirmation of being able to show your hiring leader that the companies you've identified match what they identify as target companies for that respective set of talent. Or if you've missed the mark on the companies, they'll also very quickly be able to reshift your energies to whatever target companies they would like you to be focusing your energies on. Then from there, going over the 20 sample candidates. And so depending on the amount of time that you've scheduled for this meeting, you may have time to click through all 20 candidates and get the hiring leader's feedback on that. Or you may need to just go over the first 2 or 3, and then with the action item that you'll be following up to send them the candidates for them to complete their feedback on them and empower your search moving forward. And then finally, the setting of some expectations, not only around how many candidates they should expect to see and over what period of time, but from where and in what order. And this really comes from that strategy that you set around which part of the target market you'll be going after first and for what reason, and then when they might expect to see a shift in that type of candidate. And so again, while for the purpose of this webinar, we focused in our energies on the search kickoff, how to build the map, and then how to calibrate with your hiring leader, of course, this is really just the beginning. And so after this calibration meeting is when you're going to go off and start to recruit. And so this map, to the point of its applicability, can continue to serve as a great home base as you move candidates through the process, as you start to shortlist your candidates, and as you start to get into the place of needing to advise your hiring leader on the decisions that they are making. And so in closing, if there's, again, one thing that you are able to walk away from this webinar, it's that the market map's a beautiful thing. It can add all sorts of distinguishable value to your work as a recruiter, to your leveraging of recruiters as a hiring leader, or to your management of a recruiting org and function, empowerment to all parties involved, including candidates, which we didn't really speak about, but the value that a recruiter could add to a candidate by engaging them on aspects of the market that they're very much a part of can be a huge, huge contributor to the trust that's developed between the recruiter and candidate, and then ultimately help to guide that candidate's decision-making process throughout. And then finally, on that note of applicability, again, while we only focused on a small segment of its applicability, there's really no limit to the usefulness of this market map. They're really only limited by the imagination of you and your team.
We did get a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Can you show us how you pulled the numbers for numbers of iOS or Android engineers?
Yeah, that is a good question. So this map was pulled from existing map that was built for one of our existing searches or client efforts. And so the map was built, I believe, by pulling total number of people that fit that demographic based on comprehensive LinkedIn search. And so to the degree that you want to associate comprehensiveness of market with whatever LinkedIn pulls, you could use a number like that. And to the degree that you want to get more comprehensive, then you may want to use a more sophisticated mapping technique.
Great. And the next question is, how long does it take to build a full market map?
Good question. And I'll say that no matter what I say right now, someone can say that there's no such thing as a complete market map, because a market map is an ever building process. And I'd say the most truest answer is we like to invest upfront time when we pick up a search. We like to invest 1 week of upfront time to build the map of the team, a company's map, and then a starter list of a starter candidate map. And then from there, we like to use that map as a home base and then evolve it as we continue through the search process. So you can imagine, as we continue through the search process, the candidate list continues to build, and then based on the initial set of companies that were included in the company map, that then is added to as the search takes its own direction and evolves. But we like to spend 1 week of upfront energy. We find that's long enough, but not too long, to build that initial map.
The next question is there a situation where a market map would not be appropriate?
Yeah, there are recruiters that like to practice their craft in a very comprehensive, data-oriented fashion. And there are recruiters that have made a phenomenal career out of fulfilling on searches using their intuition, using their sense. And in that case, the concept of a market map might feel stifling or limiting to however it is that they've achieved that success in the past. So in that case, using a market map would not be what that person would do.
Okay. And how do you go about mapping the compensation from various companies? How to quantify the expected cost, time for target candidates and companies?
That's a good question. Compensation is always a tricky one. There's a couple data points that can be learned about compensation through the consideration process. One data point could be a person's current comp, which currently is not legal or advised to ask, but if a person volunteers it, then that's a data point that can be mapped. A person's competing offers can be mapped to help understand what market may be for any prospective demographic of talent, and then what a person's looking for can also be a segment of data that can be mapped. And then really, to choose the right compensation for a person, you want to triangulate on as many data points as you can to include what I mentioned, as well as whatever internal parity or ranges may exist as well.
Great. How do you get the information for who are the true competitors to your company and the tools or skills they use?
So there are different types of competitors that can be included in a map like that. You could use business competitors, and so it's possible the company that you're recruiting for has a business competitor, and that the talent in that organization can be considered part of a search criteria. It's also possible that a company's direct business competitor may employ a completely different segment or quality of talent than what is desirable for your company. And so in that case, you'd look at what we might consider to be talent competitors. It could be two businesses that are in completely different spaces, but that employ a common quality or profile of talent.
And our last question is, how much time should a recruiter or talent leader expect to allocate to creating an initial market map?
Great question. And we like to recommend investing 1 week of upfront time to map the company we're recruiting for, to map the companies that we're going to be profiling, and to build the initial cross-segment of that map. We think that's a long enough amount of time, but not too long. And then from there, we like to use our map as home base to add to as the search continues. So 1 week to answer that question.
And that's all the questions that we have.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone, for joining.